The proximity alarm went off at exactly 3:47 in the morning, ship time. I was already awake because the bunk in the crew quarters had a support bar that pressed directly into my lower back no matter how I positioned myself. And I had been lying there for 2 hours cataloging my frustrations in no particular order. The broken coffee recycler was number 1. The bunk was number 2. When the alarm sounded, it moved to number 3. I pulled myself up, walked down the narrow corridor of the ESV Persistence in my socks, and dropped into the pilot seat with the kind of grace that only comes from doing something so many times it happens without thought. Owen was already there. Owen Garrett, my co-pilot, a tall man from Bristol with the remarkable ability to look alert at any hour while still managing to seem deeply unimpressed by everything around him. He had a protein bar in his hand, half eaten, and he was staring at the navigation display with a mildly puzzled expression. We drifted, he said. I looked at the display. The jump coordinates were wrong, not wrong by a small margin. Wrong by a very, very significant margin. We had dropped out of faster-than-light travel inside a corridor of space that our charts were marking in a color I had never seen our charts use before. A deep amber, almost orange, accompanied by a symbol that the ship's translation layer rendered as restricted approach lane, sovereign territory, entry without authorization constitutes an act of war. When did the drive do this? I asked. Gravitational anomaly about 40 minutes back, Owen said. The field collapsed early. We came out here instead of Sector 7 Delta. I looked at the chart again. We were not in Sector 7 Delta. We were not anywhere near Sector 7 Delta. We were, according to the navigation system's best guess, approximately 11 light-years from a planet called Verath Prime, which the database, pulling from 2 intercepted deep space signals and a xenolinguistics paper published 4 years ago, identified as the capital world of something called the Galactic Empire. I'd heard of the Galactic Empire. Everyone who spent time in deep survey work had heard of it, the way you hear about a mountain range you have no intention of visiting. Vast, old, not known for warm welcomes, not known for any welcomes, actually. I looked at Owen. He took another bite of his protein bar. I'll wake Patel, I said. Naveen Patel was our engineer. He was from Leicester. He had 3 advanced degrees he never mentioned, and he treated every mechanical problem aboard the Persistence with the focused intensity of a man who took things personally. He appeared in the corridor 30 seconds after I knocked, hair uncombed, holding a handheld diagnostic tool as if he had been sleeping with it. The drive, he said. The drive, I confirmed. He pushed past me toward the engine compartment without another word. Our 4th crew member, Claire Hodson, was the ship's science and survey officer. She was already in the small observation bay at the front of the vessel when I got back to the bridge, sitting with her legs crossed on the floor, looking through the reinforced viewport at the stars ahead. Claire had a habit of going very quiet when something genuinely interested her, the way some people go quiet in libraries or art galleries. She was very quiet now. There are a lot of ships out there, she said. I sat back down in the pilot's seat and pulled up the sensor display. She was not wrong. 12 ships. That was the initial count. Then the sensors adjusted their range and the count went up. 14. Then 19. They were arranged in a formation that I did not have the military vocabulary to properly describe, but which communicated its meaning clearly enough without vocabulary. They were surrounding us, not approaching, not retreating, simply surrounding us the way a wall surrounds a room. The largest of the ships was directly ahead. It was, by a significant margin, the largest vessel I had ever seen outside of a photograph. Our entire ship could have fit inside its secondary docking bay, with space left over. Its hull was dark and layered, built in a way that suggested not just engineering but intention, as if whoever had designed it wanted it to communicate something specific to anyone who looked at it. What it communicated very clearly was, you are small, and I am not. I was in the middle of reaching for the communications panel when the channel opened on its own. The voice that came through was not using any language in our database. The translator cycled for a moment, caught partial routes from the intercepted signals, and produced something approximate. It was not a perfect translation, but the meaning was not difficult to follow. The word treepass appeared twice in the first sentence. The phrase sacred approach corridor appeared once. Something about the light of Verath Prime and its inviolable nature, the wordshment, appeared at the end, though the translator flagged its confidence on that one at only 72%. I was fairly confident it was correct. There was a pause after the transmission ended, presumably because whoever was speaking expected a reaction. Owen finished his protein bar. I leaned forward and pressed the transmit button. Hello. I apologize for the intrusion. Our drive experienced a malfunction during jump We came out at the wrong coordinates. This was completely unintentional. We are a survey vessel. We have no weapons beyond a standard emergency flare array, and those are locked in a cabinet in the cargo hold. I paused. You wouldn't happen to have a mechanic available, would you? We would genuinely appreciate the help. The channel stayed open. No response came. Silence in space has a different quality than silence on the ground. On the ground, silence means the absence of sound. In space, silence means the universe is proceeding normally, and you are simply not part of the conversation. The silence that followed my transmission was neither of those things. It was the silence of a great number of beings processing something that had not been part of their expectations for the morning. Claire had come to stand in the doorway of the bridge. She was looking at the sensor readout. Their targeting systems just activated, she said. I know, I said. All of them, she said. I know, I said again. Do you want me to be worried, she asked. It was a genuine question, not a rhetorical one. Claire had a policy of not wasting emotional energy on worry unless someone more experienced told her it was appropriate. I thought about it honestly. We were 11 light years from any human-occupied space. We were surrounded by 19 warships belonging to a civilization that had just called our presence an act of war. Our drive was broken, our coffee recycler was broken, and I had not slept properly in 2 days. Not yet, I said. Let's see what they do. What they did was send a second transmission. The translator worked faster this time, building on the first. The voice was different, deeper, more measured, with a cadence that suggested authority in the way that certain voices always do, regardless of species. It told us that we were being held under Imperial jurisdiction. It told us that our vessel was to make no movement of any kind. It told us that a delegation would board within the next rotation of their vessel's standard time cycle. Then it added something the translator rendered, with high confidence, as, "Your failure to demonstrate appropriate alarm is noted and will be addressed." Owen looked at me. I looked at Owen. "Appropriate alarm," he said. "Apparently," I said. From the engine compartment, Naveen called out, "The secondary coupling is completely sheared. We are not going anywhere under our own power for at least 6 hours." I called back, "That's fine, Naveen. We've been asked to stay put anyway." There was a pause then. "By whom?" "An empire," I said. Another pause, longer. "Right," he said. "I'll keep working." I turned back to the viewport. 19 warships. The largest civilization we had ever made contact with. A declaration that our presence constituted an act of war. A promise that our lack of fear had been noted. I made a mental note to file an incident report when we eventually got communications back. The UEA bureaucracy was going to have opinions about this. Strong ones probably, delivered in the specific tone that bureaucracies use when they want to sound concerned, but mostly just want someone to fill in the correct forms. Outside the viewport, the largest ship in the formation moved, just slightly, adjusting position the way a person adjusts their posture when they want to make a point. I pulled up the ship's log and started typing. The drive malfunctioned, the wrong coordinates. The amber-colored restricted zone, 19 ships. The voice that told us our comm was something to be addressed. It occurred to me as I was typing that from their perspective, this must look extremely strange. A tiny vessel drops out of nowhere into the most protected corridor in their territory. It offers no aggression, no retreat, no demands. It asks for a mechanic. Its crew does not run, does not plead, does not go silent with terror. It just sits there, surrounded, and continues existing in the most ordinary way possible. I could imagine from the outside how that might read as something more than calm. I saved the log entry and went to find out if there was any coffee left that hadn't been processed through the broken recycler. There was not. I sat back down and watched the stars and waited for the Empire to make its next move. Owen fell asleep in his chair within 10 minutes. He had always been able to do that. I had always been slightly jealous of the ability. Outside, the fleet held its formation. 19 ships, perfectly still, watching a vessel that was doing nothing more threatening than waiting for morning. The delegation arrived 4 hours later. Not in the way delegations typically arrive in the stories people tell about first contact. No ceremony, no dramatic docking procedure. A tractor beam locked onto us with a vibration I felt through the floor of the ship. And then we were simply moving, drawn toward the largest vessel at a steady, unhurried pace that suggested they were not particularly concerned about what we might do during the transit. Naveen came forward from the engine compartment when he felt the movement. He looked out the viewport, looked at the ship we were being drawn toward, and said, "That is an extraordinary amount of ship." "Yes," I agreed. "The hull plating has a latticed substructure," he said, pulling out his handheld diagnostic tool and pointing it at the viewport as if the viewport were actually a useful sensor surface. The outer layer looks like a ceramic composite, but there's something underneath that's reading as a different density entirely. Could be a reactive armor system. Could be structural redundancy. He tilted the tool slightly. I'd love to get a sample. Claire, standing beside him, made a note on her survey pad. She had been making notes since the fleet appeared on our sensors. At this point, her pad had 11 pages of observations. Owen was awake again. He had combed his hair, which was his version of formal preparation. I had changed into a clean shirt, which was mine. We were brought into a docking bay that, as I had estimated, could have held the Persistence twice over with room remaining. The bay was lit in a color slightly off from white, somewhere in the amber range, which I suspected was natural light wavelength for the Vel'Karath, rather than a design choice. The walls were high and smooth, and covered in markings that our translation system declined to attempt, flagging them as ceremonial script rather than functional language. There were soldiers waiting, a great number of them, arranged in 2 lines forming a corridor from our airlock to a large door on the far wall. They were tall, taller than any human I had stood near, and I was not short. Their armor was dark and close-fitting, and they held long-handled weapons across their chests in a way that was clearly meant to communicate something. The weapons were ceremonial in posture, but not, I was reasonably certain, in function. I opened our airlock and stepped out first. The soldiers did not move. The temperature in the bay was cooler than our ship, and the air had a faint mineral quality to it, like stone after rain. I took a breath, found it breathable, and waited for the others. Owen came out second. He looked at the 2 lines of soldiers, the high walls, the ceremonial markings, the amber light, and the general atmosphere of carefully constructed intimidation. "Fancy," he said quietly. Naveen came out third, still holding his diagnostic tool, pointing it discreetly at the wall. Claire came out last, survey pad already open. We walked down the corridor between the soldiers. None of them moved or spoke. At the end of the corridor, the large door opened, and we were led by a single escort, smaller than the soldiers, wearing a different kind of garment, with markings on the collar that I took to mean rank, through a series of hallways that were clearly designed to impress. The ceilings grew higher with each passage. The materials became more refined. By the time we reached what I assumed was our destination, the floor beneath us was something that caught light like water. The room we entered was not a room, it was a chamber. There is a difference. A room is a space for doing things. A chamber is a space for making people feel small while things are done to them. This was the second kind. In the center of the chamber was a structure that served as both furniture and architecture. A raised platform with surfaces at different heights, surrounded by curved walls that angled inward at the top. The lighting came from sources I could not locate, filling the space evenly without shadows. A figure was seated on the central platform. I say seated because that is the closest word. The Vel'Karath did not sit the way humans sit. The figure's posture was upright and lateral simultaneously, occupying space in a way that I did not have easy anatomical language for. What I understood clearly was that this individual was in charge of whatever happened in this room and probably in many rooms beyond it. He spoke. The translator in my earpiece worked in real time now, having had hours of new linguistic data to build on. The translation was rough but functional. "You entered sovereign territory," he said. "You were informed of the violation. You did not attempt to flee. You did not offer surrender. You asked about repair services." "That's accurate," I said. "I am Inquisitor Zale," he said. "I am responsible for determining what you are and what should be done with you." "Maya Price," I said. "Pilot." That's Owen Garrett, Naveen Patel, and Claire Hodson. We're a survey crew, civilian. We were on a mineral survey mission and our drive malfunctioned. Zale looked at us for a long moment. He had eyes that processed information the way a scientist looks at data, not emotionally, but categorically. He was sorting us into categories that he had not yet named. "You are not afraid," he said. It was not a question. "The situation is stressful," I said honestly. "But stress and fear are different things. We have a problem. We're working on it. Many beings have stood in this chamber," Zale said. "Most require physical support before the session concludes. The architecture is designed to produce a specific psychological response." Owen looked up at the ceiling. "The angles are doing something interesting," he said. "Is that intentional? The way the walls converge?" Zale looked at Owen, then back at me. "Yes," he said after a pause. "It is intentional," Owen said. Zale made a mark in a document I could not see. I had the impression it was not a flattering mark, or rather it was a mark he had not expected to make. The interrogation that followed lasted 4 hours. I use the word interrogation loosely. It was more like a conversation that one side was trying very hard to make uncomfortable, and the other side kept accidentally treating as ordinary. Zale asked about our mission parameters, our vessel's capabilities, Earth's location, the structure of human government, and our military capacity. We answered everything honestly and completely, partly because we had nothing to hide, and partly because honest and complete answers seemed to confuse him more than any deflection would have. At one point, Claire asked if she could use the room's surfaces to sketch the mineral survey methodology she had been planning to use in Sector 7 Delta, because the conversation had made her think of a refinement to her process. Zale stared at her for approximately 8 seconds. Then he permitted it. Naveen, meanwhile, had been quietly running his diagnostic tool across the surfaces of the chamber whenever Zale's attention was on the rest of us. He was producing readings. He was, I noticed, also occasionally producing readings of the ventilation system, the wall material, the ceiling structure, and the composition of the platform Zale was seated on. When I caught his eye and made a small gesture, he shrugged in a way that said, "I'm just looking." Around the 3rd hour, Zale called a pause. He left the room with his assistant. They were gone for 20 minutes. While they were gone, Owen fell asleep sitting up. I made more notes for my incident report. Claire finished her sketch and started a second one. Naveen wrote up what appeared to be the beginning of a formal engineering assessment. When Zale returned, he looked at us with an expression that I was beginning to be able to read. It was the expression of a person who is highly competent in their field, encountering a situation that does not fit any category their competence covers. Not frustration exactly. More like the feeling of reaching for a tool you are certain you put somewhere specific and finding it is not there. He sat down. "I would like to understand something," he said. "In your time here, you have answered every question without negotiation. You have not asked for legal representation or diplomatic protection. Your engineer has been conducting an unauthorized survey of this chamber, and rather than denying it when noticed, he would, I suspect, simply explain it if I asked. Your survey officer is drawing diagrams. Your pilot is writing what appears to be a report for someone else. An incident report, I confirmed. My supervisors are going to want documentation. And your co-pilot," Zale said, looking at Owen, who was asleep, "is sleeping. He can do that anywhere," I said. "It's a useful skill." Zale was quiet for a moment. "What I cannot determine," he said, "is whether you are performing a very sophisticated kind of confidence, or whether you are exactly what you appear to be." "We're exactly what we appear to be," I said. "That," he said, "is the more troubling answer." He called for food then, which surprised all of us. It was not food we recognized, but it was clearly intended as food, and it was clearly intended as a gesture. We ate it. Owen woke up when he smelled it, which was also very on-brand for Owen. Zale watched us eat with the focused attention of someone conducting a study. He asked questions between courses, small ones, personal ones, not tactical. Where was I from? How long had I been in survey work? Whether I had a family? Whether I had ever been in danger before, and how I had responded. I answered all of them. At the end, I asked him the same questions back. He seemed not to have anticipated this. He answered anyway. He was, it turned out, from a region of Vareth Prime that had the closest equivalent to what he called cold seasons. He had been in his current role for 40 years. He had a daughter who studied something I understood as xenomathematics. He had not expected to find this conversation interesting. "You're studying us," I said. "Yes," he agreed. "That's fine," I said. "Claire is studying you." He looked at Claire, who raised her survey pad slightly in confirmation. Zale made another note. This one I thought was different from the early ones. He had started the session trying to place us in a category. By the end of it, I think he had concluded that the category did not yet exist, and that making one was going to be the most interesting problem he had encountered in 40 years. He told us we would be held aboard the vessel pending a decision from a higher authority. He told us our ship would not be damaged. He told us, and this part he said was something I could only call reluctant honesty, that in 4 decades of work, no subject had ever brought this particular session to a point where he ran out of framework. "Is that good or bad?" Owen asked. Zale considered the question with genuine seriousness. "I am not certain," he said, "but it is the first time I have been uncertain in a very long time." He left us in a set of quarters that were, if nothing else, more comfortable than the bunks on the Persistence. The support bar was notably absent from the sleeping surface. I noted this with genuine appreciation. From somewhere above us, through the hull of the greatest warship I had ever been inside, the stars were continuing to exist in their usual way. 11 light-years from home, held by an empire, studied by an inquisitor who did not know what to do with us. I updated my incident report, found that the quarters had something resembling a hot beverage dispenser, determined that one of the settings produced something that was not coffee, but was warm and had a faint bitterness to it, and decided that things could be worse. Owen was already asleep. The summons came on the second morning of our detention. It arrived via the same escort who had led us from the docking bay, the one with the collar markings, whose name the translator rendered as something approximating Second Facilitator Orinth. Orinth had, by this point, stopped looking at us with visible unease and had settled into something more like watchful resignation, as if he had decided that we were unpredictable in a low-stakes way, like weather. He led us through a different set of corridors this time, not the ones designed to make visitors feel small. These were working corridors, functional and direct, with crew members moving through them on actual business. The Vel'Karath crew members did look at us. They looked with the particular attention of people who have heard a great deal about something and are now seeing it in person, and finding that reality does not match expectation in any direction they had anticipated. A young crew member, passing in the opposite direction, stopped entirely and stared. Claire gave a small wave. The crew member backed away at speed. Orinth pretended not to have seen this. We were not going to another interrogation chamber. We were going to a communication suite, a large room full of screens and transmission equipment, where Zale was waiting alongside two other figures I had not yet met. One was in a uniform that carried significantly more markings than anyone else I had seen aboard the ship. The other was positioned slightly behind and to the left of the first, in the stance of someone whose job is to be useful without being visible. The uniformed figure spoke first. The translator gave me Admiral Karath 7, Commanding Officer, Imperial 3rd Fleet. I would have offered a handshake, but I had learned enough in 2 days to understand that physical contact was a formality reserved for very specific contexts in Vel'Karath culture, and spontaneous contact from a trespassing alien was not one of those contexts. Admiral, as I said, Maya Price ESV Persistence. Survey class, Civilian Registry. Karath 7 looked at me for a long moment. He was older than Zale, and where Zale's attention was analytical, Karath 7's was weighted. The weight of decisions already made and consequences already lived with. We have received a transmission, he said, from your home system. This was news. When did that arrive? 12 hours ago. Our long-range communications intercepted it before it reached your vessel. It is from something called the United Earth Authority. They appear to be aware of your situation. How? Owen asked, which was exactly the right question. Your ship's emergency beacon activated automatically when you entered restricted space, Zale said from the side of the room. Standard programming. We attempted to block the signal, but the encoding was on a frequency outside our usual suppression range, so Earth knew. Or at least the UEA knew, which was a slightly different thing. The UEA was the governing body that oversaw deep space exploration, mineral survey operations, and, theoretically, first contact protocols. The first contact protocols were a document that had been revised 17 times in the last 30 years, and that most working survey pilots treated the way they treated the emergency oxygen manual, glad it existed, unlikely to read it, unless something had already gone badly wrong. Something had already gone badly wrong. What does the transmission say? I asked. Karath 7 touched a surface on the console beside him. A voice came through, human, formal, speaking in the careful diction of someone reading from a prepared document. It identified itself as the Office of the First Contact Coordination Bureau, which was a department I had genuinely not known existed. It expressed, in measured language, that the UEA was aware of unauthorized entry of civilian vessel EECV Persistence into sovereign Vel'Karath space and wished to convey its regret for the incident. It stated that a diplomatic vessel was being dispatched and would arrive within 72 hours. It asked that the crew of the Persistence be held safely pending the arrival of proper diplomatic representation. It also, in a section near the end, noted that the crew of the Persistence were not authorized representatives of Earth or the UEA, that any statements or actions they had undertaken should not be taken as reflecting official human policy, and that the UEA looked forward to beginning formal relations through the appropriate channels. There was a pause after the playback ended. They're telling you not to listen to us, Owen summarized. Essentially, Karath 7 said, it suggests that you are an anomaly, that the humans we should be speaking to are the ones arriving in 72 hours. That's probably true from a diplomatic standpoint, I said. We're not diplomats, we're surveyors. We fix mineral surveys, not international incidents. Karath 7 looked at me with an expression I could not fully read. And yet, he said, in 2 days, you have produced more intelligence about humanity than our outer sensors have gathered in the 2 decades since we first detected your signals. We answered your questions, I said. We didn't think there was a reason not to. That is exactly what I am discussing, he said. Zale stepped forward then. He had a collection of notes, actual physical notes, which I found interesting, given the technology around us. He spread them on a surface between us. There were charts, which I could not read, and something that looked like a behavioral analysis grid, and a series of photographs taken from somewhere above. The four of us in the interrogation chamber, I realized. Sitting, sketching, sleeping. My preliminary report to the Emperor identifies several points of concern, Zale said. He spoke to me directly, which I had noticed was his habit. He directed information toward whoever he had decided was the primary decision-maker, regardless of who else was in the room. The first is your vessel's reactor. Naveen looked up from the corner where he had been quietly examining a ventilation grate. I've been meaning to ask about that hum, he said. Has your team had a look at it? We have, Zale said. The resonance pattern your reactor produces is consistent, under specific amplification conditions, with a frequency that would destabilize the magnetic field of a Class 4 planetary body. He paused. Your vessel has been operating with this reactor for 8 months. Naveen blinked. Well, that would explain the calibration drift we kept getting in the tertiary survey sensors. He looked at me. I kept thinking it was the sensors. It was not the sensors, Zale said. Right, Naveen said. He made a note on his diagnostic tool. Kareth 7 had gone very still. You were aware of the resonance effect? Naveen is aware of it now, I said. He wasn't before. And this does not alarm you. We'll fix it when we get the drive repaired, Naveen said. I can write up a modification that should solve both issues, actually. If you have a compatible fabrication unit aboard, I'd want to look at the specs of your equipment first. Kareth 7 looked at Zale. Zale looked at Kareth 7. Something passed between them, a rapid, silent exchange of professional concern. You are asking, Kareth 7 said slowly, to access our fabrication systems. Only if it's not an inconvenience, Naveen said pleasantly. I stepped in before the conversation could go further in that direction. What Naveen means is that he's happy to fix the issue using our own equipment and materials, with your team supervising every step. He is not requesting access to your systems unsupervised, he is just enthusiastic about fixing things. Naveen nodded. Very enthusiastic about fixing things. The second point of concern Zale told us was Claire's survey notes. Specifically, the notes she had made in the first 48 hours, which she had shared with him voluntarily when he mentioned, in passing, that the Empire's geological survey of the transit corridor had never been fully completed. Claire had offered her methodology. Zale had asked to see her existing notes as a framework. Claire had handed over her pad without hesitation. The notes, Zale told us, contained a mineral composition analysis of the hull of the Dreadnought based on non-invasive sensor readings through the viewport during our docking approach, a structural assessment of the docking bay based on the acoustic properties of our footsteps during entry, and a preliminary density map of the corridor between the docking bay and the interrogation chamber derived from the reflection angles of ambient light. It's a survey habit, Claire said. I survey everything. I wasn't trying to collect intelligence. It's what I notice. What you noticed, Zale said carefully, is a reasonably accurate structural profile of a restricted Imperial military vessel. Oh, Claire said. She looked at her pad. I can delete it if that's a problem. No, Zale said, and something in his voice had the quality of a person who has just made a decision they are still processing. Please do not delete it. Our survey of this vessel was also incomplete. Kareth 7 turned away from us at that point and walked to the viewport at the far end of the room. He stood there for a moment, looking out at the stars, and then he said something without turning around. The translator gave it to me as, in 30 years of command, I have never held prisoners who made themselves more useful with every passing hour. We're not trying to be useful, I said. We're just trying to be ourselves. He turned back. That, he said, is what concerns me most. The meeting ended with Kareth 7 confirming that we would be held comfortably until the diplomatic vessel arrived. He told us that during this time our movements aboard the ship would be expanded, within limits. He told Naveen that a supervised review of the drive modification proposal would be considered. He told Claire that Zale's department would be in contact about a potential data exchange. And then, as we were being led out by Orinth, he said one more thing. The Emperor has been informed of your presence, he said. He wishes to meet you. This will occur when the diplomatic vessel arrives. He paused. Prepare yourselves accordingly. The door closed behind us. In the corridor, Owen turned to me. Should we be more concerned about meeting an emperor than we have been about everything else? I thought about it. Probably, I said, but we're not, he said. No, I agreed. But I think we should at least wear clean shirts. Orinth, walking ahead of us, made a sound that the translator did not catch. I suspected it was not in the official vocabulary. We walked back through the working corridors of the greatest warship in the Imperial fleet, past crew members who watched us with wide eyes, past walls that Claire was quietly noting, past ventilation grates that Naveen was discreetly scanning, and back to the quarters where the sleeping surfaces had no support bars and the beverage dispenser produced something that was almost coffee. 72 hours until the diplomats arrived. 72 hours until the Emperor. We had enough time to prepare. Whether we actually would prepare in the way anyone expected was, I suspected, an open question. The diplomatic vessel arrived 11 hours early. I know this because Orinth knocked on our quarters door at what would have been, in any reasonable timeline, 4 in the morning, and informed us with the expression of a person who has stopped being surprised by anything that the UEA ship accord had dropped out of jump at the edge of the restricted zone and was requesting permission to dock. The Accord was a different kind of ship from the Persistence, where the Persistence was a working vessel. Practical, slightly scuffed, built for function, the Accord was designed to project something. It was clean and symmetrical and visually deliberate, the kind of craft that was meant to say, we take this seriously. It carried a crew of 42, of which 30 were involved in some aspect of diplomatic operations, and it had been launched within hours of the UEA receiving our distress beacon, which meant that it had been traveling fast, and its occupants had probably not slept much. This was immediately evident when they came aboard. The lead diplomat's name was Arthur Finch. He was from somewhere in the English Midlands, which Owen identified from the accent and confirmed later. He had the posture of a man carrying a great deal of responsibility and the expression of a man who had spent the past 72 hours reading reports about what we had done and formulating appropriate responses. When he saw us in the docking bay, our small group of 4, me in a clean shirt, Owen with his hair combed, Naveen carrying his diagnostic tool, Claire with her survey pad, his expression suggested that the reports had not fully prepared him. Miss Price, he said, I am Arthur Finch, Deputy Ambassador for First Contact Affairs. Good to meet you, I said. How was the jump? He blinked. He stopped. We need to speak privately. Zale was present at the docking. He had insisted on observing the meeting between the human groups, which I understood and had no objection to. Kareth 7 was not present, but I was fairly certain that everything in this bay was being recorded and reviewed by someone at his level. Arthur drew us to one side. He had 2 aides flanking him, both carrying physical documents, both with the slightly wide-eyed look of people who had expected to be walking into a crisis and were now recalibrating. I need you to understand, Arthur said quietly, the seriousness of the situation you have created. We understand it, I said. I am not sure you do, he said. The Galactic Empire controls 43 star systems. They have destroyed civilizations for lesser provocations. The fact that you are alive and apparently comfortable it is not something anyone at the UEA expected. We weren't doing anything threatening, I said. That is not the point, Arthur said. The point is that you have been interacting with senior Imperial personnel for 4 days without authorization, without diplomatic training, and without any framework for managing the potential consequences. We answered their questions, I said. We were polite. We fixed problems where we could. Claire's survey notes have been shared with Imperial intelligence, one of the aides said, in a tone that suggested this was the sentence he had been waiting to deliver. Voluntarily and transparently, Claire said, and they shared their corridor survey data with me in exchange. It was an exchange, not a breach. The aide looked at Arthur. Arthur looked at me. You have to understand, he said, and there was something in his voice now that was less formal, more direct. The tone people use when they've stopped trying to manage something and started just talking, that every interaction you have had has been outside of any protocol. The things you said, the way you behaved, the reactor information, the survey notes, any of these could have been interpreted as hostile acts. They weren't, apparently, but only because the Vel'Karath happened to find you more confusing than threatening. So it worked out, Owen said. Arthur turned to look at Owen with an expression I recognized. It was the same expression Zale had used, and Kareth 7 and Orinth and the young crew member who had backed away from Claire's wave. It was the expression of a person who has just encountered a sentence that is technically correct and completely inadequate. Yes, Arthur said. It worked out. Then what's the problem? Owen asked. The problem, as Arthur explained it over the next hour, was not what had happened. The problem was what was about to happen. The Emperor of the Galactic Empire, Velthon the Undying, 800 years old, the longest reigning individual in current galactic records, The ruler of a civilization that had expanded through a combination of military force, political absorption, and the simple weight of age, wanted to meet us. Not the diplomats, not Arthur and his aides and their carefully prepared documents. Us. He was informed of your presence, Arthur said, and of your conduct during detention. Apparently, the description of your crew's behavior during the interrogation sessions was distributed within the Imperial intelligence network. A faction within the military believes you are some kind of covert assessment team sent to test the Empire's response capabilities under the guise of an accidental entry. Another faction believes you are exactly what you say you are, which they find equally alarming for different reasons. The Emperor wants to form his own conclusion. Makes sense, I said. Miss Price, Arthur said. You will be in a room with a person who has ordered the destruction of 3 civilizations in his 800-year reign. This is not a casual meeting. I understand that. Do you? He looked at me steadily. Because what I need from you, from all of you for this meeting, is a level of careful, considered, controlled diplomatic behavior that will not, in any way, by any gesture or statement, give the Emperor cause to view humanity as a threat. I thought about this. We'll be ourselves, I said. That's worked so far. Arthur closed his eyes briefly. Zale, who had been standing at a respectful distance during all of this, took a step forward. He said to Arthur in translation, Deputy Ambassador, I have spent 4 days studying these 4 individuals. I have a professional opinion. Arthur turned to him. Go ahead. They will not behave differently in front of the Emperor than they behave anywhere else, Zale said. This is not a deficiency. It is their defining characteristic. The Emperor was informed of this specifically. It is the reason he wishes to meet them personally and not your diplomatic team. He paused. I would suggest that attempting to prepare them differently may remove the one quality that has thus far kept this situation from escalating. Arthur looked at Zale, then at me, then at Owen, who had found a seat on a supply crate and was sitting comfortably, then at Naveen, who was examining the docking bay's wall fixtures, then at Claire, who was finishing a note. Fine, Arthur said. He said it with the weight of a man setting down something he has been carrying for a long time. The journey to Vareth Prime took 18 hours. The Accord traveled alongside the Dreadnought, and we were permitted to return to the Persistence for the transit, which Naveen used to begin the drive repairs. The resonance issue he addressed first, producing a modification that he wrote up carefully and submitted to Zale's team, who reviewed it with 4 engineers and then supervised Naveen as he implemented it. The hum, when it resolved, was noticed immediately by everyone on the vessel. Several of the Imperial crew members visibly relaxed in a way that told me the sound had been affecting them for the entire 4 days we had been aboard. Did anyone think to tell us it was bothering them? Owen asked. Orinth, who had come aboard to observe the repair, said, It was assumed you were producing it intentionally. Owen and I looked at each other. Vareth Prime from orbit was extraordinary. It was blue and amber and white, with a weather system moving across one hemisphere that looked, from the distance, like a brushstroke. Claire documented it extensively. I simply looked at it for a while and thought about the fact that we were the first humans to see it with our own eyes, and that we had arrived here because our drive had broken. The approach to the surface was conducted in an Imperial shuttle, the kind designed to carry dignitaries. It was considerably more comfortable than anything on the Persistence. Arthur and 2 of his aides came with us. Zale and Orinth accompanied from the Imperial side. Arthur spent the descent going over a briefing document. His aides went over their own documents. Zazel sat across from me and watched all of us. How are you feeling? He asked me quietly. Fine, I said, a little tired. Owen finished the last of the protein bars last night. Zale noted this. The throne hall of Vareth Prime was everything the briefing documents had described and more. A half-kilometer of ascending approach, wide enough to drive a convoy through, lined with materials that caught light in ways that were clearly deliberate. Arthur's aide, to his credit, had warned me about the psychological design of the approach. The way the incline was calibrated to produce physical effort, the way the proportions grew to reduce the visitor's sense of their own scale, the way the sound changed as you moved forward, growing quieter in a way that felt like the world holding its breath. Arthur walked it. His aides walked it. By the time they reached the main doors, their breathing was slightly elevated and their posture had taken on the specific quality of people working to maintain composure under pressure. We had taken a different route. Orinth, who had been present when we arrived, and who had apparently anticipated the situation, had guided us to a secondary approach corridor that had been fitted with a moving walkway for delegates with mobility requirements. We arrived at the main doors 2 minutes before Arthur's group, completely rested, and waited for them. Arthur looked at us when he arrived. How? He said. Orinth showed us the walkway, Claire said. Arthur looked at Orinth. Orinth looked straight ahead with perfect professionalism. The hall itself was large enough that the far end was not immediately visible. The Emperor was there at the far end, and we were moving toward him. The space amplified sound in a way that made every footstep part of a larger pattern, a rolling echo that built and built as you moved inward. Velthan the Undying was sitting, truly sitting, in a way I had not yet seen a Vel'Karath do, on a structure that was less a throne than an architecture. It rose above him and spread to either side, built from materials that I could not identify at a glance, that seemed to absorb and redirect light rather than simply reflecting it. He was old in the way that very old things are old, not fragile but settled, dense with time, as if gravity applied to him slightly differently than to everything around him. He looked at us, we looked at him. Arthur stepped forward and began the formal address that he had been preparing for 72 hours. Velthan let him finish. He was patient in the way that 8 centuries makes you patient, not because he was suppressing impatience, but because time had lost the quality of urgency for him long ago. When Arthur finished, Velthan said nothing for a moment. Then he looked past Arthur, directly at me. You asked about the ceiling, he said. The translator gave it to me with perfect clarity. When you entered, I had apparently walked in, looked up at the vaulted ceiling, which was extraordinary, covered in something that was not quite mosaic and not quite fresco, depicting what I could only interpret as a map of the Empire across 800 years, and said, "Is that original stonework?" "Yes," I said. "No one has ever asked me that," he said. "Is it original?" I asked, a pause. "The lower sections. The upper sections were added in the 4th century of my reign. There was damage from a seismic event." "That's a shame," I said. "The lower sections look older. You can tell from the color variation." Another pause. Then, from beside the Emperor, one of his senior advisors made a sound that the translator flagged as untranslatable, somewhere between an exclamation and a warning. I was fairly certain it was the Vel'Karath equivalent of clearing your throat urgently at someone who is about to say the wrong thing. Velthan raised one hand slightly. The advisor went quiet. The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours. Arthur participated, and he was good at what he did. Precise, knowledgeable, careful. But Velthan kept returning to us, to things Zale had reported, to the protein bar, to Claire's survey notes, to the reactor hum, to the fact that Owen had asked about the interrogation chamber's ceiling angles and called them clever. At one point, he asked me directly, "Do you understand what you entered?" "An empire," I said, 800 years old, 43 systems, a restricted corridor near your capital world. "Do you understand what is typically done to those who enter without authorization?" "Yes," I said. Zale explained it clearly, and yet you were not afraid. "I was tired and my coffee recycler was broken," I said. I was focused on the nearest problem. Velthan looked at me for a long time. He was processing something, not the words, I thought, but the thing behind the words. The shape of it. He was 800 years old. He had met representatives of dozens of civilizations. He had seen defiance and submission and calculation and panic and everything in between. "You were focused on the nearest problem," he repeated. "It's what you do," I said. "When there's a problem, you work the nearest one, then the next one. Eventually you're through." He turned his head slightly and said something to his senior advisor that the translator gave me only partially. "This is what Zale meant." Then he looked back at us and said, "You may fix your drive. You may resupply from our station. You will provide your survey authority with a copy of Inquisitor Zale's behavioral study. And you will tell whoever sent your diplomatic vessel that the formal process of establishing relations between humanity and the Vel'Karath Empire will begin through this office, not through intermediaries." Arthur straightened. "Of course, Your Majesty. I was not speaking to you," Velthan said, not unkindly. He was looking at me. I nodded. "I'll tell them." "Good," he said. He paused once more. "The ceiling in the lower section. You noticed the color variation. That is from the original construction pigment. A mineral compound from the 3rd moon of this planet, which has no equivalent. Most visitors who look at the ceiling are looking for their own insignificance. You looked for the history of the stone." I did not know what to say to this, so I said, "It's a good ceiling." Velthan said, "Yes, it is." He dismissed us after that, formally, through the correct protocols, with a weight of ceremony that Arthur navigated beautifully. We walked back down the long approach, Arthur and his team, Zale, Orinth, and the 4 of us. At the bottom, Arthur walked beside me in silence for a moment. Then he said, "He liked you. I think he found us interesting," I said. "With emperors," Arthur said. "Those are the same thing." I gave the debriefing 6 months later, in a room in Geneva that was notably less impressive than than a Velcarath interrogation chamber and considerably more comfortable. The committee was 12 people, from 6 different departments of the UEA, and they had been reading reports about us for half a year. Some of them had the expressions of people who had formed strong opinions already. Others had the expressions of people who were still making up their minds. The session was scheduled for 2 hours. It ran for 7. I had written a full report, 340 pages, which Naveen said was thorough and Owen said was thorough, plus about 200 pages. The committee had read it. They had also read Zael's behavioral study, which had been provided through the formal channels established between the UEA and the Galactic Empire after our return. Zael's study had been circulated, Arthur told me, through several departments, and had produced a range of reactions from pride to concern, with very little in between. The committee's first question was the one I had expected. What frightened the Empire most about you? I had thought about this question for 6 months. I had thought about it on the long journey home from Vareth Prime. I had thought about it during the 3 weeks Naveen spent fully overhauling the drive, and during the 2 weeks after that, when the Persistence was in a UEA maintenance facility, and the 4 of us were in a hotel in Auckland eating things that were recognizably food, and during the mandatory medical and psychological evaluation, and during the weeks after that, when the formal diplomatic process between humanity and the Velcarath was being constructed, and Arthur Finch was, by all accounts, doing excellent work. I had also thought about it when Zael arrived. He came to Earth 8 weeks after our return. He had requested, through the formal channels, a transfer to Earth as a cultural liaison. The request was unusual enough to spend 3 weeks in administrative consideration before being approved. He arrived in Auckland with a single bag of belongings and the same careful, attentive expression he had worn throughout our time in the Empire. And he proceeded to begin studying us with the same focused intensity he had brought to everything else. He had taken up walking as his primary form of human cultural immersion. He walked everywhere. He walked through cities, along coastlines, into national parks. He found altitude difficult in a way he described as not quite physical, more like a persistent awareness of distance that his sense of self had not been designed to accommodate. He asked me once, on a walk in the mountains outside Queenstown, how I managed the exposure of height. I told him what I told the committee 6 months later. I do not stop thinking about the drop. I know it is there. I look at it, and then I step forward anyway. Zael wrote this down. He had been writing things down since the day we met. His notes, he told me once, had grown to several thousand pages. He was working on a formal paper. He expected it to take another year. The thing that frightened them, I told the committee, was not anything we did. It was something we didn't do. The committee waited. Every civilization in the Velcarath Empire, every species they have ever encountered, absorbed, allied with, or defeated, operates within a framework of acknowledged threat. You know you could be destroyed. They know they could be destroyed. Everything flows from that. Behavior, negotiation, diplomacy, alliance, all of it is downstream of that mutual understanding. The threat is real. The fear is real, and everyone participates. I shifted in my seat. The chair was the kind that was comfortable for the first hour, and increasingly pointed about it after that. We didn't participate. Not because we're brave, or reckless, or because we didn't understand the stakes. We understood the stakes. Owen knew exactly what those ships were when he looked at the sensors. I knew exactly what Velthon had ordered done to other civilizations when I walked into that throne hall. We knew. Then why, one of the committee members asked, didn't you respond accordingly? Because we had other problems, I said. The drive was broken. Naveen had a reactor hum to diagnose. Claire had survey data to process. Owen needed sleep. I needed coffee. These were present problems. The Empire was a large, serious, important problem, but it was not the nearest one. So we worked the nearest ones first. A pause around the table. It sounds like a coping mechanism, someone said. Maybe it is, I said, but it works the same either way. The Velcarath have a civilization built around the logic of overwhelming force. If you threaten convincingly enough, you win. If you are threatened convincingly enough, you lose. Every calculation flows from there, 800 years of it. And then 4 people float into their most restricted corridor, get surrounded by 19 warships, and ask about the repair facilities. I let this settle. What the Empire could not process was not our strength or our technology or our intentions. What they could not process was that we had looked at the drop, the real drop, the full scale of what could happen to us, and had not lost our footing. Not because the drop wasn't real, because we keep walking anyway, because we have always kept walking anyway. I thought about Velthon looking up at his own ceiling for 800 years. I thought about Zael writing notes that had grown to thousands of pages trying to explain something that, for us, required no explanation. That's it, I said. That's what frightened them, not us. The fact that we knew and stepped forward anyway. Because in a galaxy that runs entirely on the logic of the threat, a species that acknowledges the threat clearly, looks at it directly, and then gets on with fixing the coffee machine, that is not a variable anyone has a framework for. 7 months after our return, Zael published his paper. It was titled On the Human Relationship with Consequence. I read it on a Tuesday morning in Auckland, sitting on the steps outside my building with a mug of coffee that the recycler had produced on its third try. Naveen had fixed the recycler the week we got back. It worked perfectly now, every time, without exception, and I still made a small note of gratitude every morning when it did, because 6 months in space with a broken one had given me the kind of appreciation that only absence provides. The paper was 47 pages. Zael had a precise and careful way of writing that translated well. He had structured it as an observational study. 4 subjects, 14 days of primary observation, 6 months of secondary contact, supplementary data from the full crew of the Persistence, and from the diplomatic interactions documented by Arthur Finch and his team. The abstract was the part that people quoted afterward. It was the part that circulated through 12 civilizations, that was translated into 31 languages, that ended up in intelligence briefings and academic journals, and, eventually, in a few news stories, that tried to explain why the Galactic Empire had described humanity as the most unexpected contact in their recorded history. It read, in translation, they know the drop is there, they look at it, they step forward anyway. No other species in the catalog does this voluntarily. They are not unaware of danger, they are not without fear. They assess it, acknowledge it, and then return to the nearest problem. We do not yet know why. We are not certain we want to. I sat on the steps and read this, and drank my coffee, and thought about the morning 6 months ago when the proximity alarm had gone off, and I had walked to the bridge in my socks, and Owen had said, we drifted. We had drifted into the restricted corridor of a galactic empire, into the most significant first contact event in human history, into Zael's notes, and Velthon's curiosity, and Kareth Seven's recalibrated threat assessment, and the formal beginning of a diplomatic relationship between humanity and the oldest continuously governed civilization in this section of the galaxy. We had drifted, and then we had worked the nearest problem, and then the next one, and then the one after that. I sent Zael a message that morning. He was currently in Iceland, walking, which he did regardless of weather in a way that the Icelandic Tourist Board had apparently started finding charming. I wrote, read your paper, good work. He wrote back within minutes because Zael always responded quickly. He was not a person who let things sit. The conclusion took me longer than the rest, he wrote. I spent 3 weeks on the final section. I knew which section he meant. It was the last page, the part that did not appear in the abstract, but that I thought was the truest part of the whole paper. He had written, the most accurate description I can provide of the human baseline condition is this. They are aware of every threat, at all times, in proportion to its actual size. They do not minimize the threat. They do not pretend it does not exist. They simply do not allow it to be the largest thing in the room. The largest thing in the room, for a human, is always the nearest task. This is not denial. This is not courage in the traditional sense. It is something else for which I do not yet have the correct word. I am continuing to look for it. I wrote back, let me know when you find it. He sent me, I will. Also, there is a mountain here. I am going to walk up it tomorrow. I wrote, how high? He wrote, high enough that all the threat assessment I have done suggests I should not attempt it. I wrote, are you going to? There was a pause of about 30 seconds, then, yes. I sent back, that's the word you're looking for. Another pause. Then I will write that down. I finished my coffee. The recycler had done well that morning. The sun was coming through the gap between 2 buildings at the angle it only managed for about 15 minutes on clear mornings, and the steps were warm enough that sitting outside was still pleasant rather than aspirational. The formal treaty between the UEA and the Galactic Empire was signed 11 months after our accidental entry into their restricted corridor. Arthur Finch was the lead signatory on our side. Velthon signed nothing personally. His empire worked through designated authorities for formal documents, but Zael told me that the Emperor had reviewed every clause. The Persistence went back into service 8 weeks after our return. New drive couplings, upgraded resonance shielding on the reactor, a functional coffee recycler, and bunks with redesigned support structures that Naveen had personally specified. We went back to mineral survey work in Sector 7 Delta, the actual Sector 7 Delta, the one we had originally been heading for. and spent 4 months cataloging mineral formations in uninhabited systems and filing reports and doing the ordinary work of ordinary survey crews in ordinary sections of space. It was good. It was genuinely good. Not everything needs to be the most significant event in recent diplomatic history. Some things can just be mineral surveys. ON8 protein bars, Claire-filled survey pads. Naveen fixed things. I flew. One evening, 3 months into the survey contract, I was sitting in the pilot seat watching a particularly dense asteroid field rotate slowly against the stars, and I thought about the amber warning on the navigation display and the 19 warships and the silence on the channel after I had asked about repair services. I thought about Velthan looking at his ceiling and asking if I had noticed the color variation. I thought about Zale on a mountain in Iceland stepping forward. The proximity sensors showed nothing except rocks and radiation and the ordinary mathematics of space, which is mostly about distance